So early blight is probably the most reliable disease that growers see in southern Idaho. Every year they can count on seeing it at some level. I would say that it's more severe on the western side of the state, and as you move to the east, the severity tends to go down. And as a result, you have growers that are going to spray more times, say over the Treasure Valley, than they would here in the Magic Valley. And the same thing, we spray more than they would on the eastern side of the state. These are typical early blight lesions. There were two here and here. They've grown. They've started to coalesce together. There are concentric rings in each one, which are visible, showing the growth pattern of the fungus on the leaf. This also shows how you can get a light yellow halo around the lesion, but it looks very different than what you'd see with late blight. This lesion here shows what happens when it hits the leaf vein. It stops growing, at least for a time, or slows it down, I should say. Now, eventually it will grow beyond that, but because it takes some time to get through that leaf vein, these lesions can look quite angular as opposed to being round early on. Then you see there's other lesions that are just starting that are quite small on the leaf. Eventually, it's hard to find a leaf that, say, is 70% covered with lesions. Once you get so many lesions on a leaf, the leaf just dies. So we look at this and say, well, that leaf itself right there, that may only be, say, 15 to 20% of the area covered with actual lesions. But it won't, once it gets so far, the leaf dies. If you look closely at these lesions, they have these concentric rings, and that has to do with the diurnal growth pattern of the fungus, Alternaria solani. So it grows in these, it'll grow and stop, and then you'll see this formation of that ring there. And so this part of the field has not been sprayed with a fungicide at all during the season. So most of this leaf death that we're seeing in here is caused by early blight. We tend to see lesions on the lower part of the canopy first. Now, this late in the season, the disease is really taken off. This is Ranger russet, and one nice thing about Ranger is that it doesn't show verticillium wilt. It's fairly resistant to verticillium. So most of the death that you see here is due to early blight. Early blight will come in and you'll get these lesions. They can start almost anywhere on the leaf. They tend to be somewhat angular at first, so they may grow until they hit a major vein, and then they may stop for a time. Eventually they'll take over. They may begin to coalesce. Like down on this lesion, there were multiple early blight lesions in here, and now it's just one big lesion, but they don't tend to be round or circular like we see with late blight. They're much more slower growing. Both are managed by the same fungicides for the most part. The Alternata types are not as sensitive to the strobilurine fungicides, but we don't use much of those anymore because of resistance issues. We largely rely on group 7 fungicides. And even within that, Endura was the most commonly used one for several years, but we had a lot of resistance that built up to that, boscalid. And we also saw some cross resistance from that to some of the other group 7s. And one strength that Luna Tranquility has had, the fluopyram, is that it didn't show that cross resistance that we had to boscalid. And so it has been the product of choice that we've used for a long time. We've started to detect some resistance to it. We've really promoted that I think growers are doing a better job using resistance management. And that's key. We don't ever want to have one active ingredient going out. In fact, even though Luna has 2, with pyromethanol and fluopyram, we still recommend a protectant fungicide to go with it, like a chlorothalonil or a mancozeb-based spray. They have some activity against early blight, and they're decent, and they have activity against late blight. So when growers add that in, they're able to cover that as a more of an insurance policy, and it should help extend the longevity of the fungicides.